After socialists, communists, and Marxists create the appearance of popular support within a country, the next stage in their strategy for communist conquest is neutralizing the opposition, and there is perhaps no greater opposition to the monolithic scientific atheism of communism than God and Christianity. Today's guest will discuss how the communists have and are working to penetrate, subvert, and neutralize the church. You're watching Anarchy in America with Christian Gomez. In the introduction of his work, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Karl Marx famously wrote, "Religion is the opiate of the masses or the people." In the Bible, Psalm 14 verse 1 says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao were all atheists. However, many may be surprised to know that when Joseph Stalin was a teenager, he went to seminary to train to become a Russian Orthodox priest, and that it was there where he told a fellow student, quote, "You know, they are fooling us. There is no God." Stalin dropped out and instead became a Bolshevik communist and eventually the mass-murdering dictator of the Soviet Union. So why would communists and Marxists want to become pastors and priests or teach at seminaries and Bible colleges? Joining us today to discuss how communists have been penetrating and neutralizing the church is anti-communist researcher, filmmaker, author, and journalist Trevor Loudon. Thank you for joining us today on the show. We're glad to have you here.
Look, always a pleasure, Christian. Great to see you.
So let's dive right into it. Why would communists and Marxists want to become pastors and priests or teach at seminaries and Bible colleges to begin with?
Well, the church offers three things that every communist revolutionary wants. It has money, it has influence, and it has respectability. You know, you can preach communism from the pulpit, and if you disguise it slightly and put a bit of a Christian veneer over it, people will swallow it. People will believe it. They wouldn't believe it if you were standing on a soapbox in the local park ranting into the crowd. But if you're speaking in gentle tones from the pulpit, you know, you can preach all the socialism and communism you like, and if you disguise it appropriately, it will be accepted. Plus the large amount of money the churches have to utilize for your cause, and the general respectability that you get by being a pastor or a priest or pretending to be a pastor or a priest.
Trevor, can you tell us a bit about then liberation theology, what it is, and why it's so seductive and destructive to the church in general?
Well, liberation theology, see, the communists were the Soviet communists were trying to penetrate Latin America for a long time, but they ran up against a roadblock, the Catholic Church, which was very anti-communist and was there and had the loyalty of most of the people. So in 1957, the Soviet KGB held a meeting in Venezuela, and they introduced a new concept to all these left-wing priests from all over the continent. And that was called liberation theology. And it was basically Marxism with a Catholic veneer. So, you know, we're not aiming for heaven above, we're aiming for heaven on earth. Jesus was a socialist. You know, he was a revolutionary. So everything, it was all communism, but it had used Christian terminology, Catholic terminology, and had a Catholic veneer. And that's what enabled the communists to make huge inroads in Latin America and the Philippines, and also into variations of it into the black churches of America, and now in even mainstream churches.
So why would a Catholic priest or a Protestant Baptist minister, let's say, even want to affiliate themselves with communists? Do they know that these people who are seducing them are communists to lead them into liberation theology? Or are they willingly accepting that, knowing that it's communism? But why would they even allow that to happen to begin with?
Well, we need to understand that many of these Catholic priests, many of these Protestant clergymen were communists before they became clergymen. They were deliberately infiltrated the church. Now, Bella Dodd, who was a Catholic who became a communist, and reverted to Catholicism back in the 1930s, testified before Congress how she helped to put 1,100 young communist men, into the Catholic priesthood. The Communist Party USA has a religious commission for putting communists into religious institutions.
Wow.
The Democratic Socialists of America has a religious commission for doing the same thing. The League of Revolutionaries for a New America, which used to be called the Communist Labor Party, also has several clergymen on its rolls, Baptist pastors, Episcopalians. The denomination isn't so important, because they don't really care about the denomination. It's just getting into the churches, getting the church's money, and getting the church's audience and influence. So the communists have always been doing this.
Wow. So in last week's episode, we had as a guest Jesse Lee Peterson, and he was talking about Reverend L. Sharpton, who's a Baptist, claims to be a Baptist minister, and Jesse Jackson, another reverend. And are these men really Christians? Are they really men of God, or are they promoting a Marxist, anti-Christian, anti-God, communist agenda?
Look, they were both affiliated with communists their entire political career. I believe they were communists who used the church to suit their purpose. Another example might be Jeremiah Wright, who was Obama's pastor. He was an active Marxist. He was a Muslim radical, but he found that there was more influence by being a Christian. If he wanted to influence the black populations of South Chicago, you're going to do that much better by being a Christian pastor than an open Marxist or a Muslim radical. So, yeah, these people are communists. That's what they are. They use the church, the respectability of the church, to promote their message.
I know you've written before about the Methodist Federation of Social Action, headed by Reverend Harry F. Ward. Who are they?
Well, as you say, Christian, the Methodist Federation for Social Action was the very first communist front in America. That was set up by Harry Ward even before the Bolshevik Revolution of 2017.
Wow. I mean, 1917.
Yeah, so the churches were the first target. They got inside the churches. The Communist Party in the 1920s told its members, who may have been brought up Baptist or brought up Catholic or brought up Orthodox, to go back to the church that they grew up in, not to become Christians, but to penetrate those churches, to use those churches for influence. My good friend, my late good friend, Herbert Romerstein, who was a communist, who became a top researcher for the US Senate on communism, the expert on American communism. He said the biggest suckers during the 1920s and 1930s for communist propaganda, for joining communist fronts, being involved in communist causes, were Protestant clergymen. They were the biggest force in the country for promoting communism, not just through the churches, but in general throughout society.
Yeah, and speaking of Protestant churches and clergymen, what about the Southern Baptist Convention? It's considered the country's largest Protestant evangelical denomination. Are the communists also penetrating them? And are other conservative evangelical churches and Bible colleges also being penetrated by communists and Marxists?
Well, the short answer is yes, yes, and yes. Well, look, you need to understand, it's very simple. The communists want power, influence, complete control. They control Hollywood. They control the media. They control most of the education system. They control the unions. They control the Democratic Party. They control most of the mainstream churches. They have done for 50 years now. But the one social group they didn't have control of was the evangelical movement and the Southern Baptists. The two most, and these are the crazy people who go out and vote for presidents like Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. They elect these presidents. It sets the communists back 10, 20, 30 years. How long do you think they were going to allow that situation to continue? So there's been a very concerted effort over the last 10 years to infiltrate both the Southern Baptists and wider evangelical movement in this country. And they're doing it through social justice, critical race theory, refugee resettlement, illegal immigration amnesty. You go to most of these churches now, and you'll hear a lot more about global warming or critical race theory or ending white privilege or social justice than you ever will about sin or redemption or repentance.
What are some other examples of the penetration of evangelical, Southern Baptist, and other conservative churches that people would be shocked to know that those are being penetrated by Marxist theology?
Well, look, you got guys like Rick Warren, for instance, a well-known pastor in California, a former leader of the Students for a Democratic Society, a Marxist group. He preaches 80% gospel, well, probably 90% gospel and 10% socialism. Obama's favorite pastor. He's pushing social justice, immigration amnesty, globalism, Chrislam, an amalgamation of Christianity and Islam. But the main group that is really promoting this is a group called the Gospel Coalition. The Gospel Coalition as an alliance, a cross-denominational alliance of Protestants led by a man called Tim Keller. They're extremely influential. They hold conferences all over the place. They promote books. They have seminars. They're one of the leading bodies of modern evangelical Christianity. And it's led by Tim Keller, who is a Marxist. Got a big church in Manhattan, but he has promoted Marxism his entire career. He has got actual Marxists on the board of the Gospel Coalition, and they're heavily tied up to the Southern Baptists. So there's a real cross-pollination there. Tim Keller, if you trace his works, he says things in his sermons like the founders of communism were great men. They shared a desire to better the interests of the working man, the working class.
Wow.
So he is subtle in his promotion of communism on the wider front, but if you actually read his sermons and you look at his history, he's been promoting communism, socialism, since he was a college student. But he's one of the most respected Protestant clergymen in the country.
So, Trevor, what can Christians do to stop and eject this Marxist penetration from their churches, Bible colleges, and seminaries across the country?
Well, the very first thing is to become aware of it. We're putting out a movie shortly called Enemies Within the Church, which will draw these lines very clearly. But look, if you go to a church and you find that there's not much talking about the Old Testament, there's not much talking about the law, but there is a lot about ending white privilege and critical race theory and social justice, you're in a Marxist church. So you have got to take matters in your own hands, talk to your pastor, see if your pastor is receptive, see if your pastor has just been fooled by this stuff or is genuinely committed to this socialist agenda. You got to try and take back your own church first. Do everything you can to set your own church right. If you can't do that, find a church that does teach the Bible and not Marxism. Commit yourself to that, or start your own church or your own home church. Look, the communists took over the mainstream denominations 50 years ago. The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, most of those big denominations are almost all gone. You'll find some local churches with a good pastor who are still sound, but in general, they are gone. The evangelical movement is now half gone. It's like the colleges were 20 years ago. It's half Marxist. It will be completely Marxist in 5 to 10 years. So either take back your church, educate yourself on these issues, or find a church that does teach the truth.
Well, absolutely. So final point, Trevor, if the communists succeed in penetrating and capturing the church, so to speak, that will essentially neutralize their largest opposition to their agenda, correct?
That's exactly right. They view this is all about politics for them. The evangelicals and the Southern Baptists represent the largest conservative political bloc, voting bloc, and spiritual bloc in the country. So if they can be neutralized, That makes it almost impossible to ever elect another conservative president. It'll basically give the left complete control of every institution in America. And this is the goal. They're not, the communists are not in the churches for spiritual regeneration or saving their own souls. They're in it to use the churches to move the country way to the left to the point that it can never be recovered. And Andrew Breitbart always used to say, the late great conservative journalist, he would say, politics is downstream from culture. The culture of the country shapes the politics. But what he could have added was that culture is downstream from religion. The religion shapes the culture shapes the politics. So if you can remove the churches to the left, you're shaping the culture to the point it will never come back. You will have a permanent, monolithic left-wing bloc running this country forever. The communists learned their lesson from Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. We are not going to let the evangelicals and the Baptists take this country back again. We are going to get inside them and neutralize them, A, to get them away from the conservative movement, and B, to gradually move them into the left. And they're using critical race theory, white privilege, social justice, all of these things to move them to the left. A lot of the evangelicals and Baptists will not vote Democrat because of the Democrats' ties to abortion. So this is the argument they're using. Don't worry about abortion. If you vote Democrat and they enact their social policies, their wealth redistribution policies, that will alleviate poverty. And poverty is the main cause of abortion. So by voting Democrat, you can actually reduce abortion. And this is the kind of sophist argument that the Gospel Coalition is now running in an attempt to influence conservative Christians away from conservative politics and to accept the tenets of the far left. It's a subtle process, but they're very good at it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Trevor, for joining us today. We appreciate it very much.
Look, appreciate the opportunity, Christian. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bottom line, if the churches and our Judeo-Christian institutions fall to communism, liberation theology, critical race theory, and Black Lives Matter's Marxist agenda, America's largest opposition to communism and revolution will be neutralized. Neutralizing this opposition is paramount for those wanting to see anarchy in America. Next week, we'll discuss the fourth tactic of how communists precipitate mob violence. Until then, God bless.